If you've got daddy issues or you've got some kind of father wound that is festering and hasn't healed yet, it greatly impacts not only your life, but your relationship to God, to spirit, and your understanding of spirit, because oftentimes the way we understand spirit is as a masculine deity or figure. And so that's what we're talking about today in honor of Father's Day. And so if that's the conversation you're interested in, you're in the right place. Hi, my name is Trina Parham, and I am a spiritual mentor and guide for Black women on alternative spiritual paths. I'm also the creator of the Wild Waters virtual retreat, and that's the place where I help women find their spiritual path and reconnect to spirit. And so that's what I do. And if that sounds good to you, you're in the right place. And so today I want to have a conversation about fathers and father wounds and relationships and daddy issues and all the things that impact so many women. And I think if you've got a great father, or I think it's possible to have great parts of your relationship with your dad. And some women have amazing fathers. And I think that's a real blessing. And some of us, our relationships with our dads were on the struggle bus, and some people had absentee fathers, the whole nine. And I think that relationship, again, it impacts so many different things. So today I want to dive into the father wound and the wounds that our dads leave us with if we don't have the best or healthiest relationship with them, and how we can heal and move forward, particularly as adults. Because I think sometimes when you have a wound around your relationship with your dad, it can take you back to a very young age. It can take you back to childhood and all of that stuff. And also, as I mentioned, because we often see God as father. Now, if you've watched any of my videos, you know I talk a lot about the divine mother, the feminine face of God, and all of that. But a lot of our understanding, whether we grew up in church or not, that God or the creator, source, spirit in any way, although sometimes we might think of spirit as more feminine, but we generally can think of it as a more masculine energy. And so, yeah, that's what we're talking about. So, the father wound, what is it? It really is, to me, when you have a relationship with your dad that has left some type of negative impact on you and has a negative impact on you and your life. And so, when I think about my relationship with my dad, we had a pretty close relationship. We had a very close relationship actually when I was little, and my parents separated when I was probably in about fifth grade. And so I think what happened in my relationship with my dad that made it more challenging was when he and my mom, ended their relationship, and he wasn't the best to her. You know, he wasn't like violent or anything like that, but he just didn't treat her the way she needed to be treated. And so, the relationship fell apart. And so I think when I was younger, I aligned myself more with my dad in many ways, because he was the fun dad. He was the fun parent. I didn't live with my dad, even though my parents were together. I lived with my mom. And so my dad was very active, and I mean throughout my whole life. And but I thought, again, he was the fun parent. He was the one that bought me things, all of that. So we had that type of relationship. But my mom was a disciplinarian. She was the one that was there for the day to day stuff and all of those things. And um, so, but when they broke up, and I was getting a little older. Actually, no, I wasn't in fifth grade. I was in fifth or sixth grade when they broke up, and then I think around seventh grade was when things just really kind of fell apart. And I think around that time, I started to align more with my mom because I was so tuned into her emotions. And when I saw the way how my dad had treated her was impacting her, that started to affect my relationship with my dad. And as we went, I think what happened was I started to see my dad more as a man and less as my dad. And I was not happy with a lot of what I saw, being very honest. And so that had a negative impact on me. And so we went through years of like ups and downs in our relationship where, I was confronting him about things and I was saying things and we would get into it, or I would, I would scream and go off because I was just so unhinged by the things that I felt he did that hurt me or hurt my mom. And so we kind of rode this roller coaster in my adulthood, but through up until about 18, our relationship was pretty solid, was very solid actually. I would even say through college, our relationship was pretty solid. Even though I started to see things that sort of shifted my perspective of him. And so I think the wound that I had the most is around him not being there, I think in the way that I needed him to, and in terms of and like sort of that emotional support. And I think a lot of us have that with our dads in whatever way. And so I think you have to learn to navigate that. And what's interesting about wounds around our dads and fathers is it impacts so many relationships. And I think particularly if you're a woman that dates men, it impacts the way you see other men. And I think because my dad wasn't particularly expressive in terms of his emotions, I thought for years, for a very long time, that like men didn't have feelings and that I couldn't possibly hurt a man's feelings. That was something that I thought a lot, that I felt a lot until I got much, much older and was in a relationship with someone that described how I hurt his feelings. And that was a very interesting that was a very interesting experience to just hear that from a man. And I think what I see a lot for women who have a wound around their dads is it's this idea that um, you can't be in a relationship, you can't do these things without sort of going back to that place that really healed you, that really hurt you in the first place. And I think going back to that place is really important. And I think talking about this is even a little uncomfortable because I'm thinking about, my dad now in our relationship, and it's up and down, and I've come to peace with it, we've come to terms with it. But it's, he still can trigger me, he still can do things that really bother me and get under my skin. But we have found a lot of peace in our relationship over the years. And I think a lot of it came after my mom died, and my mom passed away about 7 years ago now. And, it was something, I don't know what triggered in him. I think even though my parents were not together, but they were very much a part of each other's lives. My dad was very much a part of our family. So if you know anything about how Black people do, we're very rare. We very rarely kick people out when somebody breaks up, especially when they've been together for so long. They've got kids, all of that. And my family was very much like that, where my dad was and still is a part of my family, my maternal family. And so and my parents would still speak and whatever. I would say they were friendly, yeah. But anyway, after my mom died, I think there was a vulnerability that my dad experienced as someone, he loved her. He loved her and he really cared about her. And I think it made him think of his own mortality. And so, and of course, he had, was getting older and all of that. And my dad, he's in his mid 70s. And so I think there was something about that experience that really cracked him open and that opened him up. And so since then, he's become a lot more emotionally vulnerable with me and a lot more open with me. And that has definitely had a positive impact on our relationship overall. And so when I think back on how I healed a lot of the wound that I had around my relationship with my dad, I'm thinking about some of those things that might be useful to someone. The first thing is expressing my feelings, my emotions, and being very open about that. And so I know everyone doesn't have the kind of relationship where they can just go talk to their dads about whatever's bothering them. But I found that to be helpful for me, even if he didn't have the language or the words that I needed to hear that would comfort me or change how I felt or whatever. Just the act of expressing my feelings to him was really important. Secondly, I think what really has helped me with my own father wound and daddy issues was, I think outside of expressing those feelings is just seeing him as a man and going back to, when he was younger and learning about, the struggles and the challenges he had in his relationship with his own parents and, learning more about the things that he was into when he was young, just the kind of person he was and seeing him through other people's eyes and seeing him as a young person trying to find his way, particularly as a young Black man growing up at the time that he did, just tuning into that and seeing him in that light really helped heal something in me. And I think also too, like letting it go and I don't look, I am someone that does not believe that forgiveness is a requirement for anything. So, it doesn't I know there's this whole idea that forgiveness is for you and not the other person. I don't think that everyone needs to be forgiven and I don't think you need to forgive everyone for all the ways that they hurt you in order to feel whole. And so, but for me, forgiving my dad for things that happened in the past was important to me and important for me to do. And again, that forgiveness didn't really come until my mom died. And I think there were times that I felt like I had forgiven him for things in the past. And again, it wasn't anything horribly egregious or anything like that, but things that did wound me, things that did really hurt me and that shaped the way that I show up in relationships or my expectations of men and in various ways, and we'll get to how that affects my relationship with God or source or spirit in a minute. But anyway, I lost my train of thought. But I think, for the idea of forgiving my dad, it just it opened me up to um, just something more and being able to create a new relationship with him. And as I was saying, that happened after my mom died, and there was something about that moment because it was like he's my only living parent and I don't want to be ostracized from him. And not that we were ostracized or anything like that, but I wanted to just let it be what it is. And I finally got to the point where I stopped trying to shape the relationship into what I wanted it to be and just gave space for it to be what it is. And so that means I talk to him when I wanna call him, or if I don't, I don't, things like that. And so I think just growing up the way I was raised too, where, you have honor for your parents almost no matter what. And so I have to be honest, like, there's still a part of me that feels that and very much still honors my dad regardless. Like, he's my dad, and I do reverence the title of father for me. And so I do revere him in that way, even though, I realize that I can have the kind of relationship with him that I want. That's reasonable for me to be able to engage with him. That's reasonable for me. And so I think just letting go of the expectation of what my relationship with him was going to be. And I think there's a part of us that when we are young, if we don't get the kind of things that we want from our dads, that we somehow want to go back in time and we want to be able to recreate it, or we want to redo. And I know for a long time I wasted a lot of years, I think subconsciously wanting a redo, wanting my dad to be a different person, wanting him to show up in different ways, and wanting him to have been better to my mother, things like that, because I saw how hurt she was and how much that affected her life. And so I think I spent a lot of time in that space, and a lot of us do because we don't know any better, right? It's like our inner child, our inner that girl child inside of us. We want we want daddy's love and attention and affection and all the things in the way that maybe we see it on TV or we see with other family and friends and things like that. And if you don't get that, it can be really tempting to want to recreate that. And I also see I also see with some like relatives and family who didn't have the best dad, but they sort of will give the dad whatever they want and kind of kowtow to whatever the dad is doing. And I wouldn't do that either. And by that, I just mean, sort of begging for your dad's affection and things like that. And I'm not doing that either. And so, but I understand the need to be loved. And I think for a lot of people, if you had an absent father, you can kind of go one or two ways where you can let it not bother you and really just ignore it. Or, you can beg. You can beg for daddy's love. You can do all of that sort of stuff. And I don't think we talk enough about how deep those wounds are, those emotional wounds. And as an adult, as a woman, you are ultimately responsible for cleaning that up. And that means how you show up in relationships and all the ways that a father wound can stymie your life, can create this arrested development. And it's hard. It's really hard. And even my relationship with my dad now, we still have our ups and downs. We still have you know, times where maybe we don't speak as often or times when we do speak. And, it can get really vulnerable and I can still get really angry and, all those things. And I always say, nobody can get under my skin the way my dad can. That is for sure. But, it's, I think the healing comes when you accept that wave, when you accept the wave of your relationship with your dad, and especially if you didn't have the best relationship with him or you've got some wounds or some daddy issues that you're dealing with, I think letting go of this idea of wanting it to be a certain way or needing it to be a certain way and finding other ways to get those needs met. Now, if you have a dad and your dad's still living and you're able to actually communicate with him in any way, I think it's really valuable to express yourself, to express how you felt or your feelings or how they hurt you or things like that. Um, and also, too, I think one of the things that I learned is how can I have good times with my dad you know, in the ways that we can. Every time I see my dad or that you see your dad, it doesn't have to be, we have to talk about the past. Sometimes it's like, oh, my dad and I, we like to go out to dinner. We like to hang out. We like to talk about music and, the things that we're both interested in. And so sometimes you have to let that be enough. You have to let that small moment of connection be enough with your father. Even if, there's things about your past that he hasn't apologized for or whatever, if it's a relationship or a connection that you need or value, I think you can get a little bit out of it. You can get the small pieces out of it that can feed something inside of you because I think that's what it is for so many of us is there's a if you didn't have the kind of dad that you wanted or if your dad didn't show up in the ways that you needed that it can leave a hole. And so when you need to heal and tend to that hole, part of the way you can do that is again confronting your dad, talking to him, expressing yourself, how you feel, all of that. But again, allowing it to just be um, pleasant, even if for the smallest moment. So you know, if you have a conversation with your dad and it's only going to be good for 5-10 minutes, so just talk for 5-10 minutes and move on. But I think and for some people the answer is no contact. For some people it's like I don't want to have any relationship with my dad whatsoever. But I think if you're tending to this wound around the father, that it's something that you have to take a closer look at and give your attention to. And so I think this idea of the father wound and daddy issues, it really does impact your relationship or perspective on God or the universe or manifestation or whatever you believe helps you create or to build. While I think a lot of that creation energy is definitely feminine energy, that is a distinctly mother energy. But we've been taught through the Abrahamic religions and traditions that, it's creator God, God the Father. And so I think if you have a negative relationship with your dad, that's how you can see God. So if your dad was absent or distant, then any type of spiritual connection, it can feel that way. And this is why I think it's so important to, number one, connect with the feminine face of God, or to not see the divine or spirit or spirituality as a gender and seeing it more as gender neutral, and thinking about spirituality and the connection to it in more neutral terms, like finding purpose, meaning, and fulfillment in life, as opposed to it being about this God, this deity, because we don't realize how much that the image of the father, of our parents, is what we project onto the divine, onto great spirit. And so again, if that relationship is negative, that's usually how you're going to see God. And so I think if you feel like your dad was a punisher or something like that, because we it's so interesting the way that we shape God and the thought of God in this country, is where God's very punitive. God's omniscient, and he's omniscient. He's all knowing, and also, but he's supposed to be loving too. And so God is supposed to be all encompassing all these things. And I think it can be hard to see God as loving and benevolent if your father was not that way. And I think this is one of the things that can keep a lot of women away from spirituality, is having your sole understanding of God be masculine. And so, fortunately for me, when I was growing up, I had a lot of loving, caring men in my life, particularly from my church. Uh, Even the pastor of my church was a really just great man, an important person in my life, a musician at my church who, really cultivated my musicianship and me as a musician, which was great. And I had a few other key male mentors throughout my life who were very supportive. And I think seeing men in that light, and particularly in the spiritual realm, that really helped, I think, shape my relationship to God, the masculine face of God, and making it positive. So while yes, there were aspects of it that were reflective of my relationship with my dad, it was also reflective of my relationship with the clergy and the men in my life who went to my church, who had a very positive, loving influence on my life. So if this is something that you're struggling with, I think you have to start small in order to heal it. And whether it's the father wound, whether it's trying to connect with God and sort of the masculine energy of God. And again, I want to say that I don't think it's actually necessary to see spirit or see God as masculine. I think we break it up into these binaries as masculine and feminine. That's just my own language for it. But I don't think you actually need that. I think if this is too big of a barrier for you, that it's much easier to just see God, spirit, whatever, as neutral or as nature or as mother. I feel like those descriptors can be really helpful if seeing God as Father is too painful or difficult. But again, I think you have to I think you have to heal that, because I think I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. When I see women who have a deep father wound, it can show up and manifest itself in so many different ways. I think it can often show up as people pleasing. And this is where the heroine's journey comes in. That's a whole other video, but this idea of the integration of being and doing. And uh, what's interesting is with the heroine's journey, you go from being essentially your mother's daughter to becoming male identified, to succeed in the world and identify more with your father, where you mean to or not. And then you have this descent where everything falls apart, and you realize you can't keep up the momentum of the life you had built in order to integrate into being and being more of who you are. And so I think that integration is really important. Again, I'm getting sidetracked here, but I think it's important to heal the relationship with your father, regardless of and by heal, I mean heal it inside of you. I don't necessarily mean that you have to heal if there's a rift with you and your dad, that you necessarily have to heal that, but that there's something that you need to give yourself because it can, like I said, it can wreak havoc in so many ways, whether it's people pleasing. I think that's one. I think if you can be really hard or rigid sometimes, that can be um, that can be a result of it. Or, depending on how you let men treat you, and not just in an intimate relationship, but just in general, whether it's your boss or, some Joe Schmo off the street. I think a lot of that has to do with your relationship with your father. Now, one of the things that my dad really gifted me with is he always believed in me, and he still does. Like whatever dream I had or desire that I had to achieve, my dad has always been in my corner. He has always been a cheerleader. He has always encouraged my dreams. He has always supported my dreams. And because of that, I felt like I could do whatever I wanted. And that's what I mean. Like I think when our dads give us very positive things, we you can see the fruits in our life. But when they give us negative things, you see the fruits of that as well. And so you have to tend to those parts of yourself and to heal it. And I think you start really simply. If there's a part of your life or a wound around with God or with your own dad that you need to heal or that needs tending or mending, that you start really small by just admitting the truth to yourself. If nothing else, that's where you start. You have to admit the pain, you have to admit the frustration. And sometimes I think what we do as Black women is we gloss over it a lot because we don't like to dip in family business all like that. I think we're getting better as a community, as a people. I think we're getting better at this by going to therapy and talking about family secrets and abuse and like all the things that happen in families that we typically don't share outside of the family, or we keep business to ourselves. I think the more that we talk about this stuff, the more that it heals. But it's important to say your piece and to express yourself and to be honest. So, you don't cover it up you know, if you're 40, 50, 60 years old and the only thing, even though your dad has hurt you throughout your entire life, but you just keep showing up, because that's oftentimes what we do as Black women. Even when we're hurt, when people hurt us, do things that almost destroy us, we keep showing up in the family. We keep doing all these things. I do not believe in that. I don't believe in that. I don't support that. And I don't do it. But I understand why we do it. And so if that's you, what's going to be really important is to admit that you've been hurt. Admit where the wound is. Talk about it so that you can clean it out and you can move forward, because it's really hard. And when you think about this, when you reflect on your relationship with your dad or the way you see God or whatever it is, God, the masculine version of God, if that's something that you see, how has it impacted your life? Whether positive or negative, because it's not all bad. So, how has that impacted your life? And I think it's really important to think through that and feel through that and be very honest with yourself about that. And so, and once you do that and you keep doing it, I think you can start to figure out for yourself and find a path for how you want to heal that relationship. And this is something that I help folks do in my Wild Waters retreat. It's a virtual 2-hour retreat. So if that's something you're interested in, the link is below this video. You can sign up for a free call and we can connect and see how I can help you and if the retreat's right for you. But anyway, so I think that's where you start, you in these very small ways, or maybe it's a conversation that you need to have. Or maybe you need to just express yourself creatively. I do a lot of art, whether it's painting or drawing or coloring or things like that. I am not an artist by any means, but I do find it really helpful to express myself in those mediums. And so maybe that's what you need to do. If this is something that you haven't tended to before, if you haven't really tended to your relationship or your daddy issues or your wound with your father or your wound around God and the church and all of that, I think that's a very masculine thing too. If you haven't tended to that, I think it's important to express how you feel about it first. And also, it can be a very embodied experience. I think EMDR, it's a therapeutic modality. If you don't know what EMDR is, look it up. I think it's amazing for this sort of work because sometimes when we have wounds from our relationships, they get stuck in our body. So it's not even necessarily a mental thing, but it's, we're holding on to it in our physical body. And so EMDR helps you release a lot of that. And then the spiritual work that I do, I think it's imperative. I think the ritual and ceremony around healing these pieces are absolutely critical. It's something that I do for myself, that I continue to do, that I do with clients, that I help clients do for themselves. And so, that's what I talk about on this channel. That's why I'm doing this and creating this video anyway. So if that's something you need to heal, I highly encourage you to do so. So trying to think what else I want to say about this. I think talk talk to your fathers if you can, if it's worth it to you. But healing this wound around daddy issues or around the ways in which your dad didn't show up for you or fell short or hurt you in some way, that it is worth tending to and taking a look at, hard as it may be, difficult as it may be to look at. And so I encourage you to do that and get some support while you do it because, you know, I really started diving into healing my relationship with my dad. I mean, it's been over 25 years and it's still a work in progress. Because I think when you have wounds early on, wounds in childhood, and I think particularly if your dad doesn't show up or change, or become the person that you want them to be or give you the right apology or whatever, it can still be difficult to deal with. And those wounds from childhood, man, it's like they get set. You know what I mean? So it's hard to break through. I think it can be hard to because breakthrough because I feel like those wounds, they help to create your personality. They help to create your personality. They really shape who you are. And so I think that's what can make it so challenging. But therapy is really helpful. The spiritual work and support that I offer is really helpful. And I think you have to do the hard work of facing it head on. And especially if you're older, if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, it's like it's time to look at that stuff. If you haven't done so already, you will be surprised at how much it frees up your energy, the levity that it brings to you, the lightheartedness, and it improves your relationships. It improves your relationships with men. And again, this is not just about intimate relationships, but how you communicate with men, how you think of them, how you interact with them, how you allow them to interact and engage with you, whether it's intimate, work related, just again, just men that you meet or that maybe that your neighbors or whomever, it really can shift and will shift those relationships once you tend to this relationship with your dad. And when you think about and make the connection to your spiritual life and how your relationship with your father has impacted your spirituality and what you believe about spirituality and what you believe about what's possible for you and what you believe about purpose, meaning, and fulfillment in your own life, what you believe about how you manifest and create the things that you need and desire. All of that is tied back to this very foundational relationship, whether you were abandoned by your dad or your dad was living in the house with you or whatever, it has a profound impact. And so I encourage you to take a look at that if this is something that you're struggling with. Okay. So that's it for today. I could say so much more if you have any questions, or I'd love to know if you have some father wounds or if you've healed your relationship with your dad, what has that been like for you? I'd love to know. So leave a comment, let me know your thoughts. And that's it for this video. Like I said, if you're interested in the Wild Waters retreat, you can schedule a free chat with me. And the link is below this video to do that. And we can talk all about that and how I can support you on your spiritual journey. And that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. And I will talk to you soon.